Where we are in lesson 6 of 8. So we're kind of moving more out of the, I'll say, strictly cultural issues, such as the genocide, slavery, sexism, homosexuality, which we covered over the last couple of weeks. And if you missed those, the videos are up. You can see the videos. And now we're moving more into the area of the Bible and science, and a corollary topic, kind of similar, the Bible, superstition, mythology, and miracles, which we'll do next week, and then we'll wrap up with, if God really wanted us to know this stuff, why didn't He make it more clear? So that's number 8. So we're hanging in there. Appreciate you coming. So going to the first question that Chris asks us for today. First, he leads with a statement, and I took this statement right off the internet as one of the critiques of Christianity. Faith is irrational because it believes in something that cannot be tested or verified. Since science relies on verification and evidence, why shouldn't we use it as the basis for all true understanding? Do you hear this? You heard this a bit? Okay. Hopefully. Right? It tends to be all around. All right. So as usual, what we try to do is align ourselves with where we agree and where we disagree with Chris's premise. So on the agreements and differences chart, we first of all would affirm, many times there's a stigma, as we know, of Christians' heads in sand, not progressive, not interested in furthering humanity, blah, blah. But I think in fairness, we affirm the value of scientific discovery. A couple of us were talking after last class, and we were talking about, and it was kind of confirmed this week, there was an article about abortion rates being the lowest in 40 years. And a number of us were speculating that primarily, probably the reason for that is ultrasound. And the ability for people to actually see that thing perhaps is not just a tissue mass or a tissue blob, but something that looks a lot more like a human being than we thought. And that was at least confirmed in one study that I read this week as a primary contributor. So maybe more than the politics, maybe more than the social dialogue, technology enabling us to be able to see exactly more into creation. And certainly the improvement of human life. We're all for that. And many of us have dedicated a bit of our lives to be able to see those things happen both within and outside of technology. What we do not accept is that natural science is the basis for evaluating all truth and all reality. And I'll explain what I mean by this in a bit. But let me start by saying I absolutely don't consider myself a scientist, but I deal in the area of applied science quite a bit in my work. I have a couple of degrees in applied science, both graduate and undergraduate, and so in the engineering and technology field, I get to see a lot of applied science, at least in action. And this idea that, science is the citadel of pure, truth descending from the mountaintop and just pure data and so forth. If you've ever worked in that arena, if you have lived amongst science being done, that's candidly not true. Science is made of scientists, and scientists, like all people in all fields, argue, fight, debate, stonewall, contend, ally themselves. It's a human dialogue, just like any arena, be it politics, be it field, obviously, medicine, be it law, any of those fields, you have sharp disagreements. And anyone who's kind of watched discussions from time to time, you can see equally qualified people, credentialed people, looking at the same data, even in data that's present today in some arena of technology some problem that you may be trying to solve, come to radically different conclusions based on their personal experience, based on the assumptions that they make, based on the way in which they interpret or see the data. So the notion of purity and the citadel of, truth coming down from the mountain with regard to science is a nice story, but anyone who's worked in the field knows that it's not nearly so pure. We don't accept natural science as the basis for evaluating all truth and reality, and I'll explain that in a moment. But let me start by saying that that statement, and you hear it quite a bit, that if it's not something that science can evaluate, can assess, then it's not true. Okay? Then it's not real. It's commonly heard, and I'm going to talk about this in a minute, but that statement, if you think about it, is self-refuting. You know what I mean? It's a self-refuting statement, because the statement itself is not scientifically proven. You can't scientifically prove that statement. So as many statements are made, it's an assertion. It may be a commonly held assertion. The assertion may or may not be true, but the statement itself doesn't stand on its own legs because it's self-refuting. And this is something that I think folks need to understand. We also maintain that philosophy and natural science are inextricably linked. They're bound together. And materialism, the philosophy of materialism, physicalism, materialism, naturalism, if you're into philosophy, there are distinctions, but I just kind of lump them together for our common dialogue, is inadequate to fully explain reality, or I'm going to even make the statement, to do science itself. That's a bold claim I hope to prove to you. So if you go to the next chart, what I'd like to do is I'd like to go back and remind you of something that I said in lesson 1. And I wanted to talk about terms and what terms mean today to the Chris's of the world. One of the terms that I used was the word faith, which we throw around a lot. Faith, right? In the original Greek New Testament, the word pistis, the Greek word for faith, basically is translated to a conviction or belief respecting man's relationship to God and divine things, generally with the included idea of trust and holy fervor born of faith and joined with it. So conviction, there's a strong conviction, there's trust, and out of that comes some action, some fervent action. The word belief, the corollary, which is tied to faith, is a conviction of something being true and worthy of being trusted. And you might remember that I said a synonym that you could use for faith would be trust in modern times. So the sense that you get, at least that I get from the term, is a strong conviction, a strongly held belief based in something that's worthy of being trusted. Now flip that to today and look at a modern definition and just Google. I just Googled Bing's dictionary. There are other dictionary definitions out there. Faith, the modern definition, belief or trust, okay? Belief in, devotion, or trust in something or something. But here's the key, and this is where you need to understand and parse the message, especially without logical proof. In other words, faith has no basis in proof, principally because what we may have faith in cannot be put under a microscope. It cannot be scientifically analyzed. So you see the definition has changed, and we need to be wise enough to be able to explain to Chris what we mean by faith as opposed to what society may be talking about. Faith in modern terms is weak, it's blind, it's hope and prayer, it's fairy tales, right? Very different than what the New Testament speaks about when it speaks of faith. If you turn to the chart, science, on the other hand, has gone through a very significant transformation in terms of the definition. If you go to Noah Webster's original dictionary back in 1828, he starts by saying, in a general sense, knowledge or certain knowledge, the comprehension or understanding of facts by the mind. The science of God, he even talks about, must be perfect. Now, he goes on, if you read it, to talk about philosophy as a science and then natural science and make distinctions between the two. But look at his terms in terms of understanding the facts by the mind. You don't see the word natural in that statement. But if you go today to a modern definition, Merriam-Webster's today, knowledge about or study of the natural world based on facts learned through experiments and observation. In other words, science is effectively natural science. The National Academy of Sciences statement is, the goal of science is to seek naturalistic explanations for phenomena, and the origins of life, the earth, and the universe are to science such phenomena within the framework of natural laws and principles and the operational rule of testability. Does that make sense? Do you hear the themes? Do you understand how the word and society's opinion of the word has changed? So, what does that mean? Let's go to the next chart. And let's start look at what the historic view of reality has been. Historically, through the ages. Historically, we have believed that there are two realms. Certainly the material realm, the realm you can touch, smell, taste, feel, that's all around. And then a non-material realm, if you like, a natural or supernatural. Non-material, spiritual. Things that are happening that are outside of the realm of visible sight or smell or touch or mind, right? Not exclusively mind, but you see what I'm saying, outside of the material. In the material realm, classically, we've believed that physical science operates. Okay, physical science operates to explain and understand the laws of nature that have been established in the material realm. In the non-material realm, historically, we've believed that physical science doesn't operate because it's not physical, right? Physical science doesn't operate in an area that is not physical. Now, if you're into theology, in the old days, the material realm, theologians believed God operated Latin potentia ordinata. The term means ordinary means. In other words, God plans out sparrows falling from the trees, as Jesus said. God plans out lightning, from the heavens, as Jesus says. But we say it's natural phenomenon. We can characterize it, we can quantify it, we can establish relationships and causality in the natural realm, the material realm. We can draw laws around it. We can assign mathematical equations, etc. In the non-material realm, as the Bible explains it, God operates potentia absoluta. In other words, he goes directly into the material realm, the non-material realm, and he operates directly, spiritually, in that interaction. And these two, occasionally you would see something, we'll talk about it next week in terms of miracles, where the non-material realm might invade, if you will, and something supernatural or weird happened in the material realm. But by and large, things that we saw in nature generally followed a pattern of laws, and those laws are pretty static. And our entire process of understanding reality in the material realm was just to characterize and harness and utilize the laws of nature, basically, that God had established. But if you go to the next chart, what has happened is that the material realm has basically assumed, and I originally drew this as the material realm getting bigger, but then as I thought about it, I realized what's actually happened philosophically is we've just shrunk reality philosophically, so that all that there is, and you go back to those definitions that I just showed you, all there is the material. That's the commonly, generally held belief. Now, there are a lot of people who believe in God and, those kinds of things, but practically, and particularly in the field of science, the material realm basically has taken over everything. The asserted change that is made by people who will argue this is, if physical science cannot evaluate something, it doesn't exist. You'll hear this from people like Dawkins and so forth. I'll believe in God if basically he comes forth and I can put him under a microscope type of mentality. But if God isn't going to show himself in the material realm, he doesn't exist. Okay? The actual change that's happened, and this is where we have to be very precise in terms of our understanding of what has really transformed. The actual change is that philosophy has used natural science to redefine reality. Do you understand what I mean? Philosophy has used natural science to redefine reality. It isn't any problem with natural science. The issue is that very cleverly, either directly or indirectly, philosophers, materialists have said natural science is real, the natural world is real and it's the only thing that's real because it's the only thing that can be measured. You see what I'm saying? This is very critical. This is probably the most important thing that we have to understand in the discussion. So it doesn't exist if it can't be measured, if it can't be tested, if it can't be scientifically verified. It doesn't exist. Now, that's different from saying it may not exist or I can't see it, I can't measure it, so I'm not sure. That might be a very valid statement. But to say it doesn't exist, God does not exist because I cannot measure him, I cannot quantify him, I cannot assign him within the realm of physical nature, is an argument basically which makes itself. It is, in some sense, begging the question. It's analogous, if you remember your high school or college physics, you remember the electromagnetic spectrum. You remember the teacher showed you the big electromagnetic spectrum, and then the teacher told you about yay amount of it is visible light. And then they told you about Roy G. Biv and all that stuff, and you remember this much visible light, this much electromagnetic spectrum. And so there's all this stuff that's going on, and that's why you have night vision goggles, and that's why you have sensors for ultraviolet radiation, sensing devices. That's why you've got microwaves. It's why your satellite communication stuff is operating in all these different bands and frequencies and gigahertz and stuff that we can't see. It's why you can't see the radio waves basically associated with your cell phone. All this stuff is happening, but you're not seeing it in the electromagnetic spectrum. Now, that's all physical. I'm not saying it's not physical, don't get me wrong, but it's analogous to saying if light doesn't exist, light does not exist if I can't see it. You see what I'm saying? I don't have a sensor to see it, therefore it doesn't exist. That is a refuting statement. Okay, it fails by any reasonable assessment. But this is exactly what has happened. So we have to, first of all, be understanding well enough to be able to explain to Chris, it isn't an issue with science. It's an issue with how you define reality. If you're going to say by definition reality cannot exist, or if you can't apply an experiment to it, that itself is a statement that does not stand up against your own scrutiny. Because you can't apply an experiment to that very statement. See what I mean? Materialism, if you go to the next chart, is self-refuting. It is insufficient, I would suggest, to fully explain reality. It explains much of reality. It explains the reality in which we do on a daily basis. It explains the natural laws that we generally operate with. We do this stuff. But I suggest it is insufficient to fully explain reality, the whole of reality. First of all, and something I've said a couple times, and I continue to make the statement, because we have to get our minds around it. If you haven't thought about it before, it may take a little thinking, a little pondering. The claim that something can only be true if it is materially provable. You know what I mean? It can only be true if I can put it under a microscope. It can only be true if I can put it into a natural scientific experiment. That can only be true. That statement is self-refuting because it itself is not materially provable. I know this is a little philosophy 101, and it's early in the morning and the coffee's still getting through, but this is critical. This is the fundamental underlying failure of materialism, is it makes claims that itself are not materially provable. Materialism, I would suggest, does not adequately account for immaterial laws like logic, like mathematics. Not the fact that we can write a mathematical equation on the board, that we can do. Not that we can't explain on the chalkboard the law of non-contradiction, that we can do. But the fact that there are universals, okay, that independent of whether I believe it or you believe it, and the same for me as it was for a person in China 3,500 years ago, these transcendent absolute laws, such as mathematics, such as if A equals B and B does not equal C, then A does not equal C. Laws that we basically take for granted on a normal basis. If somebody says go left and they're believable, you don't go right. Why? Because left is not right. Fundamental laws of logic that you apply every single day. Those are not material things in their essence. They're not material. You can convert them into some brain matter that is operating on them. You can write them on a chalkboard, but the laws themselves, the transcendent element of those laws, which basically transcend all of reality themselves, where are they? Can you feel them? Can you touch them? Can you taste them? Can you smell them? You can't. You can translate them, but they're transcendent. So I would suggest it does not adequately account for immaterial laws. I would suggest it does not appear to adequately account for consciousness or transcendent themes such as love and justice. Now I realize much work has been done. And when you get into the area of love, we know there are biochemical processes involved in love. Right? Wise parents tell their children, don't get married until 3 years after you've been dating this person, and all of the hormonal stuff that's happening and all the highs and all the, we know there's biochemical operations, but is love, is that all love is? The idea of love, the understanding of love. There are some people who have come to that conclusion and they make their wives cry. Because when they eventually come to that point and the wife realizes that they were just, some kind of operation, biochemical operation, that's not really very satisfying. Okay? Now that in and of itself does not prove that materialism isn't true. Okay? But it sheds some doubt. I think the area that is probably most compelling is in the area of consciousness. The area of consciousness. The area, or the idea that we are not just this machine without the soul. First of all, it appears, certainly we would believe, that there is a spiritual component to humanity. Now, there are many people who dispute that, right? Man does not have a soul. Man is nothing more than an animal, an advanced animal, and so on and so forth. But things like when you're talking to yourself, who are you talking to? You don't have to admit it, ongoing dialogue with yourself every single day. And it's very natural, right? It happens all the time. Well, I really need to go to the store today. No, I didn't go to the store. I forgot my keys. Who am I talking to? But I am. There seems to be a natural dualism associated with mankind, with humankind, that would not exist in a purely material existence. Okay? Others have commented that when you lose an arm, for example, you don't stop saying I. Now, you might say, I'm disabled, I lost my arm, but the essence of who you believe you are doesn't go away. Now, we know that when you have major brain injury and so on and so forth, there can be radical personality shifts. So I'm not taking away from the physical aspect of humanity, but there seems to be intrinsically within humanity something more than just this stuff. Something that isn't immaterial, something that is transcendent, something that we would call consciousness, something that we might ascribe to a spiritual domain, which, candidly, in my opinion, materialism does not account for. Materialism does not account for our understanding of properties, such as redness, if you've ever thought about this. Redness. Everybody knows what red is, right? What are you talking about, right? If you remember your Roy G. Biv, red is all the way over here in the spectrum, right? In the visible light spectrum. Red needs a carrier. Red needs light to carry, and there are elements such as someone's shirt in here. Red, people who have red shirts where basically it's absorbed. Okay? The fabric or the color, the tint, whatever, makes it up and absorbs the red light. But redness in and of itself is not a thing. It's a property. It's not a thing. There isn't any tangible element to red. There isn't any tangible element to blue. It is a property. It's a property that always, if you're into communications theory, it has to have a carrier wave. There has to be a carrier to carry it along. It has to be attached, if you will, as a property to something physical, but it itself is not physical. but you don't have any problem understanding redness. We intuitively understand it, right? It makes sense to us. You know, we assign it when we think about an apple or so on and so forth, but we can visualize red independent of the object. How does that work in materialism? So many people have listed more things than I have time to talk about in terms of the fact that materialism does not seem to be sufficient to fully explain reality. And I would go so far, and this is a bold claim, to say, as the next chart does, materialism is philosophically insufficient to do science itself. Now, this is a very interesting challenge. But let's think about some things. Let's peel back what the scientist has to do. And, you know, science, whether you're sitting in your science class or, you know, you're taking tests in school, or whether you're really doing hardcore science in the lab. First of all, the scientist has to assume the reliability of what we call sense data. We have to believe that our eyes are trustworthy. We have to believe that what we see, what we hear, you know, basically that our instruments are reliable. And we take this for granted. But that in and of itself is not a scientific statement, nor is it necessarily defensible in a randomly driven material world where things came out of chaos and are going into order. It may be true. We can assume it to be true, but it's not provable based on a material fact. In other words, we have to just assume it to be true. And there are many scientists and philosophers alike who have not come to the conclusion that it is reliable. But then you get yourself into a morass of confusion, right? You can state it, you could write it in a paper, you could go off and do things, but then you still have to walk out the door. And guess what? You turn the doorknob just like you always do and believe that when you turn that doorknob, it's actually going to be there. The reliability of sense data. The scientist also assumes repeatability and order to conduct physical experiments. Now, I understand Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, and at the subatomic level, there is noise, chaos, and so on and so forth. But even that, to define that or quantify that, requires order. We rely on repeatability and order in order to do science. Just think about any normal kind of thing that you do. If you have a problem, if you're writing a piece of code, right, and you're testing it and something is breaking, it's not working, it's not functioning, what do you try to do? You try to isolate, you call for help, you try to isolate the problem, right? You try to get to the root cause. You do a root cause analysis to try to identify what it is. And so you say, well, it's not this. I'm going to take this variable out. I'm going to take that variable out. I'm going to take that variable out. I'm going to take that variable out. Oh, it must be this. Okay, now I've zeroed in here. What happens if I couldn't assume that when I take this variable out this time, it might not pop back the next time? You see what I'm saying? You have to have repeatability, you have to have order, you have to have structure, you have to depend on those things. And in and of itself, materialism doesn't have the grounding to do that. Now, it may be true, we can assume it to be true, but there's nothing intrinsic in materialism where basically things have come out of chaos. Things exist materially, but there is no designer, there is no creator, there is no order maker, there is no structure to it. Not necessarily assumable. Science, as I mentioned, relies on higher laws of logic. I just talked about it. You try to isolate to a cause. You try to run experiments in order to be able to get to, is it really, is it testable, is it verifiable, is it reasonable, and you derive conclusions. But as I've already mentioned, transcendent laws of logic seem to escape materialism. I would assert, as many people have, that science relies on the very system that many, by no means all, many scientists in turn seek to refute. Does that make sense? You remember in the first lesson I talked about a guy named Cornelius Van Til, who was a Christian philosopher, and he said the child must sit on the father's lap to slap him in the face. What he was saying was, you are relying on underlying presuppositions which assume a theistic or Christian order in order to deny that theistic or Christian order. This is something worth pondering and thinking about and getting our minds around. Now, by no means, by any stretch of the imagination, are scientists bad and they all don't believe in blah, 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 and it's faith versus science. It's none of that. That's nonsense. The ultimate issue is the philosophical disconnect. If you're a scientist who's doing science in the construct of those two rings that I just told you about, you do science all day long, and it makes perfect sense. I work with lots of very smart people, lots of PhD types, who are Christians, and they have no problem whatsoever reconciling their faith and their science, because they understand science explains and works in this arena, and there is more to reality than this arena. But the problem, of course, ultimately comes when you assume that this is all there is. That's the problem. That's the disconnect. It's not science versus faith. It's materialism versus theism. Okay, and we have had a clever adjustment of terms so that people believe that science is hard, factual, data-driven, blah, blah, blah. It's the only thing that can explain reality, when in reality, what has happened is it's a philosophical adjustment that has happened, not a scientific adjustment. So let me stop here. That's thing one. Let's spend a little bit of time at the tables just kind of talking through some of this stuff. What made sense to you? What did not make sense to you? What did you think I was full of it? And kind of write some thoughts down, because what I'd like you to do then is take and translate that more into the Q&A session. I want to be sure we leave more time this time. So I won't go around the room right now, talk at the tables for a few minutes, then I'll do section 2 and be sure we have some Q&A. So have fun. Mark mentioned to me that it might be helpful for me to define materialism, and I probably should have done that. When I speak of materialism, it's not Madonna, it's not, it's not being materialistic, it's not that, it's not, it is the belief, ultimately it's physicalism, it is that all there is in reality is that which is the material. Okay? There is no supernatural, there is no non-material. Basically, there isn't anything outside of what you can see, what you can experience with your senses, or construct a scientific device to be able to observe. So that's what I mean by that. So if you go to the next chart, so it's a philosophical system. Go to the next chart. Hasn't science disproved most, if not all, of Christianity? Of course, there was a debate this week. I am not sure. Well, I'm not sure whether debates are good or not, but there was, and of course, this is the fundamental topic that was being discussed. And ultimately, when we talk about the disproving of Christianity by science, we're really talking about origin science. It doesn't, we're not really talking about, and then of course, supernaturalism, things, miracles, and so forth, which we'll talk about next week. So let's go to the next chart and say the vast majority of tension between Christian and dominant scientific opinion surrounds origin science. Origin science. Two variants of that. For those who have studied it, I'm sure this is very familiar. The origin of the universe, which is typically associated with the science of cosmology, and then the origin of humanity, which usually is broken into paleontology, the fossil record, and biology, basically the cell and extensions and so forth, DNA and common descent and such. Let me say, and this is very important to articulate with Chris, that origin science is unique in as much as there is no exact experiment to reproduce original events. Okay? You can hypothesize and you can simulate and you can put models together, and you can certainly come up with theories, but you cannot reconstruct the Big Bang, so to speak, right? You cannot go back and, if you believe in descent with modification from an original single cell, you cannot observe that happening. You can work on it, you can think about it, you can try to regress to it, but there are always conclusions which have to be inferred based on existing data and analysis and what I call gap filler assumptions. A good illustration of this would be the transitional forms in the fossil record according to Darwin's theory. So Darwin was very clear back in with the Origin of the Species in 1859 that basically his theory would be made or broken by what was identified in the paleontological record. If there were transitional forms, if the fossil record bore it out, and you could see the sequencing basically which he defined, then it would validate or invalidate his theory. He said, he actually wrote, the genealogical record at this point is extremely imperfect as it was, and this fact will, to a large extent, explain why we do not find intermediate varieties. At that point they had not, connecting together all the extinct and existing forms of life by the finest graduated steps. He who rejects this views on the nature of the geological record will rightly reject my whole theory. Well, I think it's commonly understood that the record has not panned out the way in which he anticipated. It's one of the major objections that's held, whether it's true, whether ultimately you claim evolution is true or not, the record has not borne out the way in which Darwin anticipated it would. But that hasn't changed the conclusion. The underlying assumption is something more like punctuated equilibrium or major movements in terms of migration, but it didn't fundamentally change the conclusion. It was just a different gap filler analysis that was done. A different set of assumptions were applied by the scientific community to arrive at the same conclusion. Historically, although assumptions change, ultimate conclusions do not. One of the major criticisms of quote-unquote intelligent design or creationism is the scientific community saying there is no basis for real falsification. You know what I mean by that? If you've studied, you know that at least in modern definitions of science, falsifiability, the ability to be able to demonstrate that something is not true, that it's false, is fundamental to the scientific method. So they say you can't put God under an experiment, so you can't prove or disprove it. So it's not subject to falsifiability, therefore it's not real science. That's the basis. And you can understand the argument if you're coming from their perspective, but neither has origin science been really true to this as well. I just gave you an example where the conclusions didn't change. Nobody really followed Darwin's opinion. They just changed the underlying assumptions or theory as to how and which these transitional forms occurred. Similarly, just to kind of prove, how this kind of works, during Einstein's time, if you weren't a seven-day creationist by and large, with a few exceptions, you held to a cosmological model which was Kantian in nature. Immanuel Kant, he was a philosopher in the 1800s, a very noted philosopher, and he basically held to an infinite, unchanging universal model. It was static, and it was unchanging, and it was infinite. When Einstein developed his general theory of relativity, he came to the conclusion fairly quickly that the underlying theory, and I don't have probably the expertise nor the time to explain to you how he concluded this, basically invalidated the Kantian model. He did such to the point, and it bothered him so much that he introduced a cosmological constant into his equation, which he later said was the biggest mistake of his life, because he didn't like the result of what his general theory of relativity led to. It basically changed the ultimate conclusions. So he changed the constant so that it would arrive at a Kantian model. Now he undid it, right? And people are by and large largely in the camp of the Big Bang Theory today, which stemmed from Einstein's work and others. But what I'd like to suggest is falsifiability goes both ways, right? I would suggest that people who are dogmatic about these origin theories are equally impenetrable with regard to falsifiability. If something is proven to be false, you just change the conclusion. the assumptions to arrive at the same conclusion. There's just as much of a problem there, in my opinion, as trying to reach for a God that exists outside of the material realm. So, what I'm trying to get to is, in the conversation with Chris, modern equivalences between repeatable, observable phenomena like gravity, right? You can test, you can set up a test, you can demonstrate gravitational constant, you can certainly do it in a Newtonian sense, and ultimately can do it in a relativistic sense. Those things can be demonstrated based on something that we have today, right? Origin theory is always going to be looking backward, trying to assess the best that we have today and regress back to something that began. An equivalent to say gravity and macroevolution are equivalent, are categorically false. You've heard this. Well, talking about whether evolution is true is like saying gravity is not true. Right? It's a lot of hubris. It's a lot of, it's to some degree arrogance or ignorance to make that statement, because the type of science is very different. Now, there's a lot of this. Eugenie Scott arguing about whether evolution took place is like arguing whether the Earth is spherical. Intelligent design disguising religion as science is offensive to people who prize honesty. But when you begin to kind of undo this a little bit, and I just want to give you one example. So there's a book, a kind of classic book by Douglas Futuyma, and he was arguing, obviously he's a proponent of evolution, and he cites an individual, Richard Lewontin, who's a geneticist, and who was a one-time president for the Society of Study on Evolution. And he said, evolution is a fact, not a theory. Birds evolve from non-birds. Humans evolve from non-humans. No person who pretends to any understanding of the natural world can deny these facts any more than he or she can deny that the Earth is round, rotates on its axis, and revolves around the sun. Definitive. Unequivocal. Absolute. No question. So he was interviewed later, and a journalist said, do birds evolve from non-birds, humans from non-humans? What about these claims? And he said, he paused for a split second and said, these are very weak statements, I agree. Those statements flow simply from the assertion that all organisms have parents. It is an empirical claim, I think, that all living organisms have living organisms as parents. The second empirical claim is that there was a time on Earth in which there were no mammals. Now, if you allow me those two claims as empirical, then the claim that mammals arose from non-mammals is simply a conclusion. It's a deduction from two empirical claims. But that's all I want to claim for it. You can't make the direct empirical statement that mammals arose from non-mammals. Do you understand my point? I'm trying to identify the fact that you have to make underlying assumptions in order to make the model work. And your conclusions, as in everything, will ultimately line up very closely with the assumptions that you make. So saying something like gravity and macroevolution are equivalent in terms of truth claims, whether or not macroevolution is true or not, they're not equivalent. It's not intellectually genuine to be able to make that claim. Now, there are, if you go to the next chart, plenty of opinions on the topic. I have tried to group things together as best you can as far as origin opinions. I don't have time to go into all the details, but this is kind of how it lines up. And when I took progressive creation, for example, I lumped a lot of things in there. Probably should have done a little bit more with that. But the long days, so, you might also say allegorical days, the idea that the Genesis record is poetic, the framework hypothesis, if you're familiar with that. There's a lot of different opinions, but basically majority science today believes this, and there's always divergence. The Earth is, or the age of the universe is 13.7 billion years. The general opinion is the Big Bang. There are certainly alternate opinions. The age of the Earth is 4.5 million, and the origin of humanity is evolution from common descent via natural selection. That's generally the held scientific position today. Of course, if you watch the debate, you saw the position of special creationist, Ken Ham, who argues for the young earth, 6,000 to 10,000 years, that God directly created ex nihilo from nothing, something from nothing. Obviously, the age of the earth was right behind the age of the universe, six-day creation, and God directly created. And again, I cheated a little bit by saying progressive creationism, and I included gap theories and day-age theories and allegorical frameworks, and maybe I could be a little bit more distinct. But basically, all of them have the common denominator is that it's not a literal 6-day or 144-day creation, or 144-hour creation. There's a longer period, whether it is that you interpret the Hebrew word for day, yom, differently, or whether you believe that there were gaps, or whether you believe that the Genesis record is allegorical or poetic or whatever. However you come to that conclusion, basically what you're trying to do, what has been attempted to do, is take what has generally been observed and is understood in the scientific community and merge that, or reconcile that, or understand that in terms of the Genesis record. So, age of the universe, roughly same, but the difference, of course, with progressive creationism or any creationism is that God is directly involved. Okay, it's not something that just happens naturally, God is involved. So there is an old earth, and God directly creates. Theistic evolution, which some Christians adhere to, most notably Francis Collins, who was involved, probably still is, I think, involved in the genome study, led the genome study, is a theistic evolutionist. He believes in, I believe, the old Earth, or the old universe, the 13.7, I believe would hold to the Big Bang, but most certainly would hold to an evolutionary record. But the difference that he would hold to, and others like him, is that it was directed by God. It was God's mechanism to use evolution as his creative force. And that is and although this has been looked upon by evangelicals dimly over the years, even Tim Keller's recent book seems to allow for the thought of theistic evolution. So, to be fair, there are people who are esteemed in the evangelical community which at least appear to allow for it. So there's a lot of opinions on this, and we're not going to solve it in 5 minutes. But what I would like to do at least is to kind of set the framework of understanding of the various opinions. And then I'd like to kind of step back and just look at the next chart, which is the Genesis record. Now, I hope that by abstracting this, I'm not offending anybody who's conscious or their position on 6-day creation or wherever you may fall down on the Genesis record. But let's step back and see what Genesis is saying, in my opinion. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. God created mankind innocent and uniquely in his image. Male and female, he created them to be joined together to multiply and to subdue the earth. Humanity sinned against God because evil existed, was tempted, sinned against God, and fell into moral corruption. Humanity was cursed as a result of the sin. God initiated a plan to redeem his creation and his people from the curse of sin. Every one of those positions that I saw, that I cited previously, have issues with them, associated with them. Certainly, if you hold to a young earth, there's quite a few things that you have to reconcile with regard to the majority science position. But if you hold to a progressive creation position, you have to deal with what Ken Ham said, which is, where did death come from? And wasn't death a violation of the fall? And if so, how does that square with something that is long in terms of progressive creation? And certainly with theistic evolution, you have your own problems with regard to God's creative approach. But if you step back and look with Chris at the Genesis record, I believe that it holds up very well with regard to any conversation that need to be had as an introduction. So you can get in with Chris later on and begin to debate whether special creation is true or whether progressive creation is true and what the problems of each one of those may be. But this big picture framework that Genesis gives maps very well with everything that we need to have in terms of a conversation with Chris. If you go to the next chart in the beginning, there are dozens of variants of cosmological theories out there. If you Google cosmological theories, and you find a table, you will find no less than 25 or 30 different theories. Some of them are based in religion, some of them are based in ancient philosophy, some of them are based in modern science, but most center on either a static universe, unchanging universe, infinite universe, an oscillating universe, or an expanding, contracting, something like Big Bang. Okay. Now, I mentioned already that from the Enlightenment era until Einstein, this Kantian steady-state infinite universe was popular. Okay, and many people still hold to this. The Big Bang isn't absolutely accepted by all scientists. But the problem that you have with this model is the whole idea of infinite time. Time needs a starting point. Any series needs a starting point. If you remember your math and you remember series, you remember that an infinite series is something that's only theoretical. Because if you think about time and you think about regressing time, regress, if there's no start, there's nothing to regress to. There's no n, there's no n plus 1, n plus 2, n plus 3, n plus 4, t plus 1, t plus 2. You see what I'm saying? You have to have a t. You have to have a t equals 0. You have to have a starting point. So any idea of a Kantian steady-state model which would imply, something like this has to deal with the whole issue of infinite time. Of course, I talked about Einstein's theory of general relativity and Hubble's redshift. I didn't talk about that, but basically the idea that the universe is expanding based on Doppler shifts and Hubble's observation of those, and then cosmic microwave radiation. And it gets pretty exotic pretty fast, and people who are a lot smarter than me. But the bottom line is that the majority opinion in the scientific community shifted to the Big Bang. But here's the issue. And Google NASA's write-ups on these things, or common things on the Big Bang, there is no uniform opinion among scientists about what started it. Now, there are certainly opinions. Every once in a while you'll see Stephen Hawking came up with a theory about what happened in Planck time, if you know what I mean. If you've studied this at all, you know that there was an infinitesimal period of time which Hawking is dealing with, which he alleges says that it proves that there's an infinite universe. But there's no uniform opinion about what started it. And there's no real position on what the universe is expanding into. In other words, as Paul Davies has said and others have said, that's outside of the realm of natural science. Is there a creator? Can you argue, as many have, from this, even if you accept this theory, even if Chris accepts this model, that in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth? And I think you can. So I don't see, independent of what you may believe on that, or what Chris may believe on that, ultimately Chris has to explain, how did something come from nothing? That's the $64,000 question. Independent of whether it was, billions of years ago or thousands of years ago, how did something come from nothing? Male and female, he created them. In 1859, of course, Origin of Species, and everybody associates Darwin with the beginning of the evolutionary theory, but that's not true. Evolutionary models, at least, had gone back all the way to Greek philosophy. But the core of the evolutionary theory, at least natural evolution, is this. There's a diversity of species which have evolved, and you remember your science books, trees, right? Branches from trees, from a common descent via natural selection. Those are the three key elements if you reduce it. There's all kinds of different opinions, but those are the three key elements. Now, in any discussion with Chris, we need to be careful about making a distinction between adaptation, okay, and which we commonly call microevolution, which is, the famous moth turned black because, because of all the smokestacks and coal mills and all that kind of stuff. Nobody really debates microevolution. Nobody really debates adaptation. The debate is over transitional life forms, phylum transitions, macroevolution. That's where the debate lies. Now, the core areas of the debate, just for education and discussion, center around the complexity of the cell structure. There are many, many people, evolutionists, non-evolutionists alike, who say that the probability of a random occurrence of genetic sequencing, even to initiate a single cell, is so infinitesimally small that it is likely impossible. Now, smart people, such as Francis Crick, such as Richard Dawkins, defend pre-biological evolution. They don't even defend it. They reach to something like seeding of humanity from extraterrestrial life. Dawkins states it, Crick stated it, basically some sort of theory of willful monster or directed panspermia. And basically now the theistic evolutionist, the Collins, he doesn't have to worry about this. His starting point, his creator of the cell was God. But everybody else has to really contend with this. The fossil record I mentioned in transitional forms, whether they hold up, whether it holds up to what the original model or an existing view of the model, such as punctuated equilibrium or equivalent, would hold. And of course, the power associated with natural selection. What's the forcing function? What's the power source? When you talk to somebody, and I've talked to people who, are strong proponents of the evolutionary model, and they talk about sieves, and they talk about natural selection, and pretty soon those sieves start taking on a very deity-like thing. Because you start thinking about it, and it's like, there's got to be a forcing function in order to be able to create order out of chaos. What is it? We know there's a lot of force in nature, but it seems to be very random, and it does not seem to be something that drives to conclusion. So this is obviously a very hotly contested issue, right? It's obviously a very dogmatic debate, and I will say it's dogmatic on both sides of the equation. Let me leave you with this, and this is very important, I think, in the discussion with Chris. The dogmatism of the debate takes on a religious proportion because it is a religious debate. It's ultimately a religious debate surrounded around science. That's something that has to be understood. The atheist community has gotten a pass because they have been able to say that atheism is not religion. Atheism is religion in every definition of the word. The only reason why they can say atheism is not religion is because they do not claim that there's a God. Non-theism. But in terms of metaphysics, in terms of ethics, in terms of existence, in terms of behavior, in every form of what you would assign an organizational religion, atheism is. And ultimately, once again, this is a debate that has religious, angst and dogmatism associated with it because of the implications. The implications of macroevolution, natural macroevolution not being true are that I have to contend with a God. What is that God? What's the God like? I don't like that. You will hear people say, I don't want to think about the idea of a God. I don't like that. I don't want, it's not even in my trade space because I don't want to consider it. That's not science. That's not pure science. That's psychology of scientism. So I'm going to close here with some sniff test questions that you could ask. You know what I mean? Sometimes if you're a manager and you've got these smart people, and they're banging on each other, and the ideas are flying back and forth, you just have to step back and say, does that really pass the sniff test? I mean, you can really get into the forest for the trees, right? So let's just ask some questions to Chris. Do you believe something can come out of nothing via natural causes? If you don't, where did it come from? What's the source? What's the starting point? Is that a God? Could it be a God? If you believe that the universe is all there ever has been, do you believe the universe is God? Okay? And if you believe it's not God, how do you account for infinite time? Those kinds of questions. Starting points. Independent of whether it's 13.7 billion years or 10,000 years. Did something come from nothing? Do you believe everything you know about humanity can be explained through a natural evolutionary process? That was the basis of Francis Collins. We might disagree with Francis Collins, but the reason why he became a professing Christian was because the natural evolutionary process didn't explain everything about humanity to him. It didn't have purpose. It didn't have meaning. It didn't have ultimate questions about life and death and afterlife. Do you believe order naturally comes out of disorder? This is a very important question. And I'm not arguing second law of thermodynamics. I know about closed forms and all that kind of stuff, theoretically. But common sense. I live on the beach side. things rust on the beach side. I sat and watched a house being built, okay? How does raw material get converted into finished goods? How does raw material get converted into finished goods? Work has to be applied to take something which is raw material and turn it into a house, or any construct of order or form. How is that happening, Chris? Are you seeing this happen? Does this happen in front of you? Because what happens in front of me is entropy. Entropy happens unless work is applied to overcome it. So independent of whether you get into the nits and noise of the second law, just common sense, Chris. Look around. Look around. Things decay, things erode, houses do not build themselves up. And I understand there's millions of years involved and so forth. But gut feel, sniff test. Do you believe there's a natural force that's driving selection of a more advanced species among an evolutionary tree? What is it? What's that force that's taking something which is more primitive and forcing it into something which is more human-like? Where does that force exist? How do you explain it? It's an assumption of natural selection, but it's not something that I don't believe, at least, has been accounted for. And here's one I just made up. It's just a thought. Do you believe male and female variants of the species can stay lockstep through millions of years of evolution so that continuous reproduction can occur? Now, obviously, evolutionists would say, yes, they do. But think about that. Through every one of those transitions, the male and female, member of the species had to stay lockstep so reproduction could continue. Now, you can say, well, a lot of it didn't happen. There were a lot of branches of the tree that fell off and so on and so forth. But a few did, and that's what kept. Well, what's the probability of the lockstep of the male and the female perfectly staying in step for reproduction through the entire 4.5 million years? Sniff tests, high-level questions, no absolute right or wrong. There could be a scientist who could come in and absolutely come in and bang on every one of these in great detail. But step back, Chris, ask yourself some basic questions about how you're seeing reality. Does it match what you're being told? All right, I'm going to stop. I've gone over. I apologize. But let's do as many questions as we